This is my Team Associated SC10 4x4. Much has already been said about the SC10 4x4 in many online reviews and magazine reviews, so I'm not going to repeat much of that. I want to go over here my particular setup because I think it's a little bit different from what some others may have been advocating. So I'll just go over the electronics very briefly. I run a Tekin RX8 speed control. I love this speed control. It's really good. I also run one in my Hot Bodies VE8. Excellent speed control. I have a Tekin Pro 4 4000 kV with a 13-tooth 32-pitch pinion. This setup is more than sufficient. I get plenty of torque with this Pro 4 4000 kV motor. More than enough to clear whatever jumps exist on the racetrack that I race at. MRT transponder. I have a Spectrum SR300 receiver in here. The servo, as you may or may not know from the first RC10 B4.1 video I made, I'm a big fan of high-tech servos. So here I have the HS7954SH high torque servo in here. By the way, I will eventually do a follow-up video to the RC10. I have made a bunch of changes to this chassis since I last made a video. But anyway, getting back to this. A few things to note now that I've covered the electronics. If you are just picking up an SC10 4x4 or if you already have one, I highly recommend the STRC aluminum bell crank set. One weekend when I was racing, I had a crash that didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary, but this top piece here of the bell crank, when I had the plastic version in here, it cracked, and replacing that is difficult because you have to basically rip apart the entire front end just to get to the bell crank. So it was not something that I was able to do at the track. I had to forfeit my standing in the race, unfortunately. So this aluminum set has been great so far. It installed very nicely. It's what, like 20-30 bucks, I think. Very much worth the money. This is probably the single aftermarket upgrade you should get if there's anything you would consider getting. That's been because you don't want to break this. Again, you'd have to take apart the entire front end. So if you can avoid breaking this altogether by getting aluminum components, then start with this. I did buy RPM A-arms for the front and rear. I haven't installed them yet, though. These are still the stock A-arms. They work just fine. I did also get RPM, I believe, rear hub carriers, because I did break one of the rear hub carriers in a previous crash. But that and the this part of the bell crank here were the only two things that I've actually broken on the chassis. Otherwise, this thing is incredibly solid. This thing has taken a lot of abuse so far. As for the actual setup itself, it is well known that this chassis has a ton of steering with the stock setup. And so I have tried to combat that myself. I did watch Jang's Ultimate RC video on his SC10 4x4 setup. I thought it was very helpful to me. I took some of his advice. For example, I increased the roll center on the rear initially by 2 millimeters, but then later on I added another 2 millimeters. So I have a total of 4 millimeters of spacers here under this ball joint to increase the roll center by 4 millimeters in the rear. And I have this rear ball joint on the outermost hole, and on the rear hub carrier, the ball joint there is on the innermost hole. So I have the highest camber gain setting here, and I found that, at least for me, to help. I know that Jang mentioned that having the highest camber gain setting was a bit too much for him, but it seems to work pretty well for me. On the front, I did add 2 millimeters of spacers under the front ball joint, but otherwise the ball joint positioning is stock in terms of the hole position. It's on the outer hole here. Okay. So one thing I noticed about why this truck steers so much is it's not really because the front is very responsive. What's actually happened, at least as far as I have observed, is that the rear is rolling too much. So yes, reducing the roll center helps a fair amount, but that does not really solve the fundamental problem. And when I noticed what Zhang had mentioned was to use the stiffest roll bar settings in the front and the softest in the rear, and I had tried that, and at least on the track that I raced at, it didn't help me because at the end of the front stretch, there's a high-speed sweeper to the right, and the way the car loads up or the chassis loads up when it takes that sweeper, basically the rear end rolls so much that the chassis basically does a 180. If you don't catch it out, it'll spin out when it takes that sweeper. And what ends up happening is when the suspension compresses, let's see, maybe I should put this on the floor here to better illustrate what's going on. So normally, if you just press down on the chassis like this, the camber angle on the left and right side will increase in the negative direction, okay? But if you have chassis roll, like on the left or right side like this, say if I have chassis roll in this direction, you notice the camber goes positive, not negative. So when you have unidirectional suspension travel, say to the left or the right, camber goes positive. When it's bidirectional, or rather just straight up and down, camber goes negative, okay? So by increasing the camber gain, I increase the amount by which the camber goes negative when this suspension compresses like this, but also I decrease the amount by which the camber goes positive under chassis roll. And that is where it's really helping out, because as under the stock settings, the chassis was rolling so much that basically only the outer part of the tire was making contact. And that's not enough to maintain traction, so the car spins out. Okay? So what I actually did, and by the way, these are just tires I used to test on the street, these stock tires here. I race with whole shots or suburbs on this chassis. But anyway, I actually stiffened up the rear rather than softening it. So I pulled the preload spacers down a little bit. I don't remember exactly what the spacing is. But I also used the outermost mounting post on the rear shock tower and the innermost hole on the suspension arm and the stiffest anti-roll bar. Okay, so this is about as stiff as I can make it without buying stiffer springs or using thicker damping oil. This actually helps more than by keeping the stock suspension setup and just changing the roll center and using soft rear anti-roll bars. Using a stiffer setting in the rear, for me at least, helps a lot, and that just minimizes how much the chassis rolls to begin with, okay? So when you think about setting up a chassis like a short course truck, try to think about it in terms of setting up an SUV to drive in the real world. Very sports-oriented SUVs like the BMW X5, for example, they have a much stiffer ride than less sport-oriented SUVs, so that they can handle better on the road. So if you can apply those principles to four-wheel drive short course chassis and get about the same result. Okay, so I make the rear stiffer, not softer. That helps a lot with preventing the car from hooking on high-speed sweepers. Okay, and the front, I do have the softest anti-roll bar up front. So far, this seems to be working okay. Basically, the stock setup up front, I may fiddle with it a little bit to tune it in, but the big thing is the rear. Making the rear actually stiffer seems to help in this case. And that would seem counterintuitive because conventionally, if you make the rear stiffer, you end up getting more steering. But that assumes that under both the soft and stiff settings, you have relatively little chassis roll. When you have a lot of chassis roll, like in this chassis with the stock setting, having too much chassis roll can actually hurt you. So make the rear stiffer. That'll help you a lot. You'll notice a big difference. Let's see. Other things. The clicker, I just have it fully locked. I think the slipper clutch is set to the stock setting. So there's nothing really out of the ordinary other than what I did to the rear here. So I just want to point this out as something a little bit different than what others have suggested, like what Jank suggested. I try to set up. It probably works for him. It doesn't really work for me. So I try a stiffer setup in the rear. Maybe that'll help you out. Let's see. I think that pretty much does it for this. Again, this chassis has been well covered in other reviews and articles. So get the aluminum bell crank. You get some RPM suspension arms. I mean, you don't really need to. These are the stock arms and they work just fine. Make the rear stiffer and you'll be pretty much set just by doing those things. Okay, that's it.